Thank you very much, Noah, and thank you to the CTG for having me here today. So the work that I'm doing now at the GSC is kind of a combination of my backgrounds. It's what happens when you take economic geology and then you do a whole lot of structural geology, and then you go, how do I get to do both of these? And well, you'll see the results of that. So today I'll be talking about my work looking at critical metals in VMS deposits, quickly where exactly they are, why they're there, and with the heavy emphasis on the role of deforming and metamorphosing those deposits, because I can't not do structure. And this is work that I'm doing with my colleagues at the Geological Survey. It's Jan Peter, Dwayne Petz, Matt Polivchuk, and Riccardo Graziani. And this is just some nice picture of deformed sulfides to get started. I was amazed at the cool microstructures you can see in sulfides. It's just like looking at a shear zone in metagranites or whatever, except everything's now a sulfide. And here we've got a nice competent pyrite porphyroclast. It's wrapped by foliated pyrrhotite, and it's got these tails of the yellowy chalcopyrite. But we'll dive into the sample a little bit more later. For now, I'm going to start this talk with a brief background on critical metals and on VMS deposits, volcanic massive sulfides. And then I'll dive into the specifics of this specific case study. Two heads up. One, if you were at Queen's University a couple of weeks ago, some of this might look familiar. I hope it's still interesting. And two, this is all still very preliminary work. So I'll be mentioning models and ideas, but one day when you read the papers, they might have changed because this is still very much a work in progress. So critical metals, you'll hear them called critical minerals, critical materials, generally referring to all the same things. Conveniently, they all abbreviate to CMs. So critical metals are firstly non-fuel materials that are considered essential to the economy and national security of a country. So for example, all those weird unpronounceable metals that go into your smartphone, your computer, these are essential for communication and modern technology. So a lot of those get included. Nowadays, this increasingly includes materials that are essential for low carbon or green technology. For example, your average 3 megawatt wind turbine, like the one pictured here, needs an impressive 4.7 tons of copper and 2 tons of rare earth elements. That's just for one wind turbine. So those get firmly chucked onto the critical metal list. And finally, critical metals must be obtained from a supply chain that is vulnerable to disruption. So if it's something that, yes, it's important in our technology, but it's cheap and common and easy to find, we're not too worried about it. But to be counted as critical metal, there must be some uncertainty. So for example, this map shows the countries accounting for the largest share of the global supply of critical metals. So as you can see, South Africa over here provides 90% of the world's iridium. And China is the main single supplier of a whole range of metals. And as you can imagine, anything that disrupts production in one of these countries or export from them will have a major effect on global industries using that material. So a whole bunch of countries have started coming up with their own critical metal, critical material, critical mineral lists with, things that they want to make sure they have a good supply of, make sure they understand where they're coming from. Now, the criticality of different things varies from country to country, depending on their economy, their local resources, all sorts of things. So a number of countries have come up with their own slightly different lists. This is Canada's official list as of 2021. And these are the metals, critical metals, that I am mostly focusing on in these projects. And that's because they're the main ones found in massive sulfide deposits. So speaking of massive sulfides, quickly introduce you to VMS deposits. So VMS stands for volcanic hosted or volcanogenic massive sulfides. And they are deposits that form sort of at the seafloor when you have these really hot metal-rich hydrothermal fluids that rise up through the crust, through this feeder zone, get here and then precipitate out either at the seafloor or just below the seafloor. And these sulfides are typically rich in copper, lead, zinc, sometimes gold and silver. And if you have a look at the picture on the right, that's a typical deep sea black smoker. It's the fine particles of those metal sulfides that make up the black smoke. And essentially, these black smokers are VMS-type deposits that are actively forming on the seafloor. Now, there are a lot of different potential primary controls on critical metal distributions and concentrations in these deposits. For example, if you have a look in this image, they reckon some of the components for these VMS deposits might have come from the leaching of ultramafic rocks. So they'll leach different metals, different amounts of metals, than if the fluids had come from, come through the sediments and leached things there. If you end up scavenging metals from seawater, you'll have a different suite of metals. Then the conditions of the fluids themselves can also control the amounts and types of critical metals. So the temperature, the pH, the redox of the fluids. So this is already quite complex, but there's more. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. So several studies have found that the modification of sulfides during deformation and metamorphism can significantly change that original critical metal distribution. So for example, these images are from a study by Kudrow et al. 2020, and they show germanium-bearing sphalerite. On the left, we have a transmitted light photomicrograph. The dark areas are germanium-rich. The pale areas are germanium poor, the yellow ones. And the labels show germanium content in ppm. Now, the image on the right is the same area, but with the grain boundaries marked in gray. So you can see that the high germanium area, that's over here, is really coarse-grained. And in this case, that's primary hydrothermal sphalerite with high germanium. The low germanium areas, like this, are really fine-grained. And in this case, that's recrystallized sphalerite. So this suggests that the dynamic recrystallization of sphalerite expels germanium. And that's really important if you're trying to extract germanium from your sphalerite mine, or if you're going out looking for good deposits to mine for germanium. So now we'll have a look at the case study that I'm working on. And for the first one, we chose the Windy Craggy VMS deposit in the mountains of Northwest BC. It looks amazing. Sadly, we had all the samples we needed, so I didn't get to go, but it looks incredible. That red square is the breakout position of the main adit. It's pretty wild. So here we have a map view of the deposit showing the host basalt and argillite in black and white, and the different types of mineralization, the massive sulfides in red and yellow. So Windy Craggy is a copper cobalt deposit with lesser gold and silver, comprises mostly peartite and pyrite-rich massive sulfides. And there are two things that make it really good for my study. The first is the high cobalt content. So we can really get our teeth into the distribution and controls of this particular critical metal, although I am looking at others while I'm working on it. And the second is the fact that this deposit has experienced really localized deformation during green schist facies metamorphism. So we have both deformed and relict undeformed sulfides that we can compare. So, for example, here we have slices of drill core showing on the left, relatively undeformed massive pyrite, and on the right, a beautifully folded, bedded sulfide assemblage. And this is really nice because the sulfides in these beds like this tend to retain a lot of primary textures, but then you have stuff that's been remobilized, like these coarse grained bits, it's been remobilized into the fold hinges. So we can kind of compare those compositions and see how they change during remobilization. In thin section, you can also distinguish kind of undeformed and deformed sulfides. So on the left, we've got pyrite rhomboids and those sort of round shapes. And that's typical of sort of low temperature hydrothermal plus minus bacterial activity type pyrite formation. And on the right, we have that highly deformed friend from the first slide, which is just really cool. So now we're going to take a quick look at the methods that I'm using, just so you know how I'm getting the data that I'm talking about. So first, I try to find a sample with both less and more modified sulfides, so I can directly compare their compositions. And that's really important in VMS deposits because their chemistry and the mineralogy changes drastically from one area of a deposit to another. So here we have a mosaic of photomicrographs through a part of a thin section. And you can see that, sorry, this is all semi-massive peartite. So all the pale stuff you see is peartite, and the gray stuff is silicate gangue. It's a bit of albite, a bit of chlorite. The upper part is semi-massive, coarse-grained, less deformed. The lower part has a beautiful foliation that's highly sheared. So this is the perfect thing to kind of look at. Then for sort of both chosen sites, more deformed and less deformed, I map the sulfide microstructure using electron backscatter diffraction, EBSD. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but it's an SEM-based analysis that can map out the crystallographic orientations of whatever mineral you're looking at. So in this image, all the colored parts are peartite, and the different colors represent peartite grains with different orientations. Then I'll go and raster the same area with laser ablation ICP-MS, and that is to map out major and trace element composition. So this is just a element map for silica, or molecular map. I'll have different legends on these, but I'll always have warmer colors being higher concentrations, even if the numbers change. And as you'd expect, silica is quite high in the feldspar and chlorite, and really low in the peartite. So by combining these data sets, along with standard petrographic observations, I hope to interpret two main things. Firstly is, what is the origin of the sulfide textures that we're looking at? Are they primary? Have they been remobilized? Were they remobilized by partial melting, or were they remobilized by mechanical means like dislocation creep? That kind of thing. And secondly, I try to figure out how this modification affected their critical metal contents. And now we've got one last slide before we dive into some actual results. So we're going to have a look at what we might expect. And this is a figure from Moser et al. 2022. It's actually a paper on titanite, but I've used it here because it really illustrates the concepts nicely. So just pretend that this is a sulfide grain and that the shades of blue are the concentration of your favorite critical metal. So what we're looking at here are the distribution patterns that we'd expect to result from different remobilization or modification processes. So for example, if you look at A, if our PET critical metal is diffusing out of our sulfide grain, we'd expect some sort of diffuse gradual zonation, some like gradual change in concentration like you see here. If you look instead at E, if our sulfide was partially dissolved by hydrothermal activity, and that material was then reprecipitated, but with a bit of a different composition, you'd expect some patterns like this. And finally, if we look at, say, F, and this is one I've adapted, if a sulfide grain experienced dislocation creep during deformation, it might show subgrains and internal distortion like this. And if our critical metal displayed a similar spatial pattern, we might then assume that it's affected by dislocation creep. Cool, so now we have an idea of what we're looking for. Let's have a look at some actual results. And just to get started, we're trying to figure out what are the main hosts of the critical minerals in this deposit. So we start with some photomicrographs showing, again, peartite, the brownish color, pyrite, which is kind of the pale yellow, and then chalcopyrite, which is the bright yellow over here. Ooh, my pointer's all over the place, sorry. And if we look at the compositional maps, in this case, these are cobalt composition maps, we can see that peartite hosts quite a lot of cobalt, several hundred ppm. So, okay, that's important. If we look at this map, though, we see that pyrite hosts even more, in this case, several thousand ppm. So this is why I say warm colors will always be higher, but the actual numbers might change. If we look at another critical metal, indium, well, almost all the indium in these samples is in the chalcopyrite here or in these little inclusions over here. And I can do this for all the critical metals we're interested in, just to get an idea of broadly where they're sitting. Now, we're going to see what we can learn from some of the undeformed sulfides. So here we have a little pyrite framboid. So these are little round shapes, And they are typical of pyrite that forms at fairly low temperatures, maybe during diagenesis, maybe low temperature hydrothermal activity, and often with a lot of bacterial or microbial activity. So we're going to call this, this is probably some of our really early pyrite, and we'll call it pyrite 1A. If we look at an EBSD map of this rhamboid, we see that it's made up of a whole lot of tiny unstrained crystallites. They're all different colors, so they're all different orientations, but each crystallite has only sort of one blank color. It's solid. So that shows that there's no internal distortion, and the rhamboid overall is not distorted. So this thing hasn't been deformed at all. Here we have another example where we have similar fine-grained, undeformed pyrite here. So that's probably more of pyrite 1A. But in this sample, it transitions into this coarse euhedral pyrite over here, which is also unstrained. Got a little bit of internal distortion here, but that's probably just a growth pattern. So it's unstrained. So this is probably the result of static recrystallization of that early fine-grained pyrite. So that's probably sitting there. It's like, getting a bit toasty under the seafloor, maybe a bit of extra heat around, and it just recrystallizes in situ. And we're going to call this pyrite 1B. Here we have another example. So this is, again, just a reflected light photomicrograph. But in this case, my pyrite is actually oxidized quite a lot. Usually you clean your slide and get rid of that. I really like it with sulfides because it highlights a lot of the textures. And because of that, you can see that we have this nice euhedral pyrite core. It's probably pyrite 1B. But you can see that it's kind of overgrown by something over here, another generation of pyrite. You can see the kind of bands. In the EBSD, you can't see any difference. They're in perfect crystallographic continuity. So it looks like our second generation just kind of epitaxially overgrew our older pyrite. But where you can see a difference is in the composition. So this is our cobalt map, and it really stands out. You've got pyrite 1B in the core, really low cobalt. And that new pyrite that's overgrowing it, very high cobalt, several thousand ppm. So that I'm calling pyrite 2. It's definitely a later generation of cobalt-rich pyrite. And this pattern of concentric bands with different compositions looks a lot like what we'd expect from growth zoning, which makes sense. The higher cobalt content in that later pyrite, it might mean it formed at higher temperatures, higher salinity, or maybe just from hydrothermal fluids that had more cobalt available. And slight variations in that amount of cobalt or in the conditions of precipitation lead to slightly different compositions in each of these bands. So now, if we look at some of the other compositional maps, which aren't shown here, I can see that the high cobalt is also associated with other metals like bismuth, tin, and antimony. And previous studies by Schmidt and Leybourne and others have shown that this particular suite of metals is typical of magmatic influence. So it looks like our pyrite 2, those overgrowths, probably formed from hydrothermal fluids that had a magmatic input. Now we have another photomicrograph just showing the different pyrite generations. Again, if you look at it when it's tarnished, they get highlighted really nicely. And here we've got, again, early pyrite 1A, which was forming rhamboids earlier. It can also form coliform growths like these. That's these big circular structures, and like this guy. And again, those are rimmed by coarse-grained euhedral pyrite that looks much cleaner. The stuff here where it's forming nice little cubes. Now, we've seen that coarse euhedral pyrite, like rims, could be pyrite 1B, in which case they probably formed by static recrystallization, and we'd expect them to be cobalt poor. Or they could be pyrite 2, in which case they formed from that higher temperature hydrothermal activity with magmatic input, and we'd expect them to be cobalt rich. Sadly, I don't yet have compositional maps of the sample. I will take bets if anyone wants to bet which pyrite it is. My personal bet is that it's probably pyrite 2, the high cobalt, high temperature hydrothermal magmatic one. And that's because it's associated with a whole bunch of other sulfides, galena, sphalerite, chalcopyrite. And that suggests it's probably the later pyrites formed from those higher temperature fluids that were carrying a whole lot of different metals. Yeah, I'm going to pause here for a sec and try summarize some of the findings so far in a little bit of a cartoon. So we can start putting together a model for the cobalt distribution. And we start off with our framboidal and coliform pyrite 1A, which was formed during sort of early low temperature hydrothermal activity, maybe even just diagenesis. And that probably had a lot of bugs around, a lot of microbial activity. There's not much cobalt in the system at this time, so pyrite 1A is cobalt poor. Then it gets statically recrystallized to form those euhedral pyrite 1B overgrowths. We haven't added any components to the system, it's still cobalt poor. But then we have an influx of hot hydrothermal fluids with a magmatic component. They're rich in cobalt and other metals, and they precipitate this cobalt-rich pyrite 2, along with pyrrhotite, chalcopyrite, and various other sulfides. Ooh. Now we're going to have a look at some of the deformed sulfides and see what they can add to the story. So this is our friend from the first slide, and it just shows a really nice example of how all these different sulfides can respond in very different ways to the same deformation. So we've got the pyrrhotite forming kind of the ground mass of the host, and it's been smeared out to define the foliation. So it kind of defines the shear zone in this case. The chalcopyrite, well, that was probably remobilized like by a fluid-assisted mechanism, because we have coarse-grained hydrothermal pyrite in other places. And during deformation, it seems that that was dissolved and reprecipitated in low-strain zones, such as on the edges of this porphyroclast to form those tails. And the porphyroclast itself, well, it's pyrite and it pretty much hasn't done anything. The pyrite is really competent, really strong relative to the other sulfides, so it tends to just kind of sit there and let everything deform around it. And that's why earlier when we were looking at the undeformed sort of early primary things, pretty much all of that's pyrite because it's the only one that preserves those early textures. So here we have the semi-massive pyrrhotite that we saw earlier. Again, you've got less deformed over here and more deformed over here. In the middle, I'm showing the EBSD microstructure maps of both the coarse-grained, less deformed, and the fine-grained, more deformed areas. And the important thing here is they're both at the same scale. So you can immediately see that the foliated, deformed area is much finer grained. Then if you look closely at some of the grains in both maps, here, and if you zoom your eyes in over there, you can see that within the grain, there are variations in the color or the intensity of the color. So that shows that the crystallographic orientation is varying. So you've got internal distortion, so internal strain, which shows that you've got some deformation actually affecting these grains. And then finally, we can also use EBSD data to plot pole figures showing the orientation of pyrrhotite grains. And you can see in the coarse-grained, less deformed area, you've got a bit of a preferred orientation. That's pretty decent. But in the highly deformed area, it's a much, much stronger preferred orientation. So all of this together suggests that our pyrrhotite was experiencing mechanical remobilization during deformation. It experienced dislocation creep and dynamic recrystallization, causing us to decrease the overall grain size and strengthen the preferred orientation. Now, important for this study is the fact that this seems to be associated with a bit of a decrease in the cobalt content. Our less deformed pyrrhotite has up to 1,300 ppm cobalt. Our more deformed pyrrhotite maxes out at about 1,100. So that's kind of cool. It looks like you deform the pyrrhotite, it kicks out some cobalt. Where did it go? Well, if you zoom in on this sample, we can see that we have tiny grains. You can see that's a 20 micron scale bar. So really small grains of cobaltite, so cobalt arsenic sulfide. And that suggests that maybe the cobalt that was expelled from pyrrhotite during dynamic recrystallization went and formed these discrete grains of a new cobalt-rich mineral. That's really cool and also really important for the metallurgists if you're trying to extract cobalt from this deposit. Now, I want to double check this. It's only a theory for now. Let's see if it stands up to some more evidence. Here, I did a large area scan on the SEM that automatically detects all cobaltite grains. And it's pretty cool. It can detect stuff as small as 2 microns. And on the right, I've shown each of those cobaltite grains that was detected in pink. And you can see that it looks like they are concentrated down here in the sheared area, but it does also occur up here in the less deformed area. So that makes our model a little bit tentative. You know, are the cobaltite grains dependent on deformation to kick out cobalt and form? It remains to be seen. My mission at the moment is to find peartite that's even less deformed than this, because this is, you know, still a bit deformed, and see if that's also associated with cobaltite. So watch this space. Now, this sample can actually also show us an example of fluid-assisted remobilization. So here we have the same EBSD maps as before, but now I'm comparing them to compositional maps for lead. And you can see that the lead pretty much outlines the peartite grains, especially over here. You can see it really nicely. There we have lead outlining a grain with lead along a stripe through there. That's this grain and this subgrain boundary. So lead is sitting on grain and subgrain boundaries. And we see the same thing for silver, antimony, and sometimes also for bismuth. And this suggests that these elements, lead, silver, and antimony, are really mobile during deformation. They're moving along the grain boundaries, moving along any other boundaries they can find, and this is probably with the help of a fluid. Now, as another example, here we have some coarse-grained hydrothermal sphalerite. We've got transmitted light photomicrograph on the left and reflected light on the right, same picture. And you can see this really coarse-grained sphalerite, which is quite dark red, and it's cut by a zone of paler orange sphalerite. That doesn't show up very well in the reflected light photomicrograph, but you can see chunks of pyrite sitting there. Now, if we look at the EBSD maps, we can see that the coarse dark sphalerite is, yep, it's very coarse grained. Sort of that is a single grain, and it's cut by a lot of twins. And the fine grained sphalerite, well, the pale sphalerite, it's so fine grained, I had to go do another EBSD map of that area at a much higher resolution. And now you can finally start making out individual grains. So they're really like just a few microns across. And again, looking at the internal distortion and recrystallization, we can say that sphalerite probably deformed by dislocation creep and experienced dynamic recrystallization to form these really fine grains. What did that do to composition? Well, this one did some cool things. So here we have the compositional map of gallium, another of our critical metals. And we can see that it's mostly concentrated sort of in the cores of large grains. For example, that highish gallium corresponds to that grain over there. You can see the same here, there's a grain, there's a grain. And this looks a lot like what we'd expect if gallium was removed from coarse-grained sphalerite by diffusion. So I imagine we have original hydrothermal sphalerite, got a fair bit of gallium in it, and then you start losing gallium to sort of intragranular fluids or something, so it's being lost along grain boundaries, gradually diffusing out. Now, I've started work on trying to actually quantify the compositional changes like this. So using software called XMAP tools, highly recommend, really cool. I can outline, so you feed in your compositional maps, and you can outline different areas like I've done here, and then extract all the analyses within them. So I've, in this case, outlined some coarse sphalerite. Heads up, this is including several grains, so it includes several grain boundaries. And I've outlined areas of fine-grained recrystallized sphalerite, which by necessity includes grain boundaries because they're just so fine-grained. The really funny shapes are because I'm avoiding inclusions and holes and trying to get as a pure sphalerite as I can. And here we can compare those compositions. So we've got composition on the y-axis, concentration, with a log scale, and then different elements shown along the X. And each of these box plots with a different color is for a different textural group. So the bright green is the fine-grained recrystallized sphalerite, and then the darker ones are our coarse-grained sphalerite. And I've included those polygons we just saw, where it's coarse-grained areas but includes a few grain boundaries. That's the darkest one. And then I also did other polygons where I just included the core of the grains, so excluding grain boundaries, just to see how much of a difference that makes in the composition. And you can see that in general, coarse-grained sphalerite has higher manganese. So we're losing manganese when we recrystallize it. Same for iron, you lose a bit of iron when you recrystallize. Gallium as well, not quite as clear, but it's a bit lower. And the same for germanium, it's a bit lower in the dynamically recrystallized areas. Now, in contrast, here we have a map for silver, and it behaves a lot like lead that we saw earlier with the peartite, in that it's concentrated along grain boundaries. You can see that really clearly in these coarse-grained areas where it's sitting on grain boundaries, but also sitting on twin boundaries, these parallel lines over here. So this silver is really kind of going in along any boundary it can find. We have very high silver in this area. Now that could mean that somehow dynamic recrystallization means it just absorbs silver from somewhere. I think it's more likely that because it's dynamically recrystallized, it's really fine-grained. Because it's fine-grained, you've got a lot of grain boundaries. So if silver is on the grain boundaries, you'll have a lot more silver in this area. And again, we can quantify that. And here you can see with silver, much higher in the fine-grained recrystallized areas. Same for tin and antimony, kind of with gold, whole bunch of elements. And that suggests that all of these guys are being remobilized in the fluid phase and moving along grain boundaries. A good question would be where they come from. I'm not yet sure of that. We just know that they get concentrated along grain boundaries during deformation. The ultimate source would be really interesting though. So we can summarize all of this in a really dry, boring looking table. Don't worry about reading everything. Don't worry about the details. The important thing is that I've got sort of three main stages in the evolution of the deposit. Our early diagenesis, maybe low temperature hydrothermal activity. Then we move on to that high temperature hydrothermal activity with magmatic inputs as some main mineralizing stage. And then we have our deformation and metamorphism. If we look at what's happening in each stage, early diagenesis, well, the only sulfide we really have around at that time is pyrite, and that's the only one that preserves textures. And at that point, we're forming the pyrite 1A, coliform framboidal pyrite, cobalt poor, overall very little cobalt in the system. Then we have the main mineralizing stage. We've added these hot hydrothermal fluids with a whole lot of metals. We form high cobalt pyrite. So we've added additional pyrite with a lot of cobalt. And we go and form a bunch of other sulfides, carrying various other critical metals. And then we go and deform and metamorphose everything. Well, we still have a lot of cobalt in the system. It didn't go anywhere. It's still mostly sitting in the pyrite, which kind of just shrugged off the deformation. But some of the cobalt that was in the peartite might have been remobilized, extracted from that peartite when it recrystallized, and gone on to form cobaltite. Still need to confirm this, but it's a cool model. However, we can also summarize this in a much more aesthetically pleasing way by adding to that cartoon we saw earlier. And there we go. When we deform it, the cobalt sitting in pyrite 2 just kind of carries on sitting there. But some of the cobalt in the peartite might get expelled and form those discrete little cobaltite grains. One day there will be an updated cartoon that'll summarize the sphalerite and the various other minerals and other critical metals, but like I say, work in progress. With that, I will say thank you very much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.